CSI Petersburg. Is that coming? I think it's coming. And on CSI, there is no distinction made between historical science and observational science. These are constructs unique to Mr. Ham. We don't normally have these anywhere in the world except here. Natural laws that applied in the past apply now. That's why they're natural laws. That's why we embrace them. That's how we made all these discoveries that enabled all this remarkable technology. So CSI is a fictional show, but it's based absolutely on real people doing real work. When you go to a crime scene and find evidence, you have clues about the past. And you trust those clues, and you embrace them, and you move forward to convict somebody. Mr. Ham and his followers have this remarkable view of a worldwide flood that somehow influenced everything that we observe in nature. A 500-foot wooden boat, 8 zookeepers for 14,000 individual animals, every land plant in the world underwater for a full year. I ask us all, is that really reasonable? You'll hear a lot about the Grand Canyon, I imagine, also, which is a remarkable place, and it has fossils. And the fossils in the Grand Canyon are found in layers. There is not a single place in the Grand Canyon where the fossils of one type of animal cross over into the fossils of another. In other words, when there was a big flood on the earth, you would expect drowning animals to swim up to a higher level. Not any one of them did. Not a single one. If you could find evidence of that, my friends, you could change the world. Now, I just want to remind us all, there are billions of people in the world who are deeply religious, who get enriched, who have a wonderful sense of community from their religion. They worship together, they eat together, they live in their communities and enjoy each other's company. Billions of people, but these same people do not embrace the extraordinary view that the earth is somehow only 6,000 years old. That is unique. And here's my concern. What keeps the United States ahead, what makes the United States a world leader, is our technology, our new ideas, our innovations. If we continue to eschew science, eschew the process, and try to divide science into observational science and historic science, we are not going to move forward. We will not embrace natural laws. We will not make discoveries. We will not invent and innovate and stay ahead.
There used to be a layer of water above this first layer, above the atmosphere. And that's not uncommon. And many of the planets in our solar system have a vapor barrier, have a canopy, a cloud cover. And the Earth itself has 6 or 7 different layers to the atmosphere. There used to be a layer of water. Psalm 148 talks about the waters that be above the heavens. When God first made this world, there was a canopy of protective water above the atmosphere. The purpose being to shield the Earth from outer space cosmic radiation, and also to provide greater air pressure, and to give the Earth the greenhouse effect. So everything grew enormous in the pre-flood world. It filtered out the radiation. I'll skip through some things here from my normal presentation that I do at churches. Today, people are rarely over 7 or 8 feet tall. Robert Wadlow is almost 9 feet tall, extremely rare. But pre-flood skeletons have been found of people like this one found in a coal mine in Italy. This one is 11 feet 6 inches tall. There were 7 or 8 12-foot skeletons found in a coal mine in West Virginia. Now, the evolutionist wants you to think man started off small and we're getting bigger and better and stronger and smarter, and we are the gods of this universe. The Bible says we were made in God's image. Man may have been 10, 12, 14 feet tall before the flood. They were living 900 years. It was a different world. In that pre-flood canopy, under the pre-flood canopy, people and animals grew to be huge. Go ahead and skip up there, if you would, through all this, up to whatever number's next. Not only were the people much bigger before the flood, the animals were much bigger. Fossils of nearly every kind of animal alive today have been found in fossil form that are huge. Rhinoceros, 18 feet tall, have been found. Now, the evolutionist says, the scoffer says, well, this was during the Jurassic period. There's no such thing as a Jurassic period, but this was in the pre-flood era. Animals were huge. Dragonflies with 36-inch wingspan have been found. Grasshoppers, 2 feet long. Cockroaches, 18 inches long, have been found fossilized. Cattails, 60 feet tall. I'll scan through this quickly. Beavers, 8 feet long, have been found. Giants of all sorts have been found. Giant sharks, giant turtles, giant birds, 13 feet tall. Skeletons of enormous proportions compared to today's standards have been found. The Bible-believing creationist like myself says this was in the pre-flood era. from the creation until the flood, for 1,600 years, it was a different world. Things grew huge. Everything was giant. Even the lizards grew to be huge. The lizards were the dinosaurs, because lizards never stopped growing. Lizards in the pre-flood Garden of Eden conditions would grow to be enormous, and we have lizards of all types today that are miniature dinosaurs, and most of my research in cryptozoology has been on even some of the bigger dinosaurs, 25, 30 feet long, that are still alive, like Loch Ness Monster, Lake Champlain Monster, Mokele-Mbembe, Ogopogo, and Lake Okanagan, and I can go on for hours just on that subject. There are some dinosaurs still alive. Go ahead and skip up to the next one there if you would, brother. I'm not saying there's millions of them, but there's a few, and the whole scenario of evolution is insane. After the flood, though, Genesis chapter 9 tells us two things changed. Man and animals were allowed to eat meat after the flood. In the pre-flood world, they didn't eat any meat. And today, everything is suffering. The whole creation is suffering and pain and travail, and God's going to fix it back like it used to be. Let me skip up to just a few here. Then we get into Noah's Ark. People say, no, wait a minute. Was the ark big enough to hold all the animals? I believe even dinosaurs were on the ark. I've got a model here. This is a 1/600th scale of Noah's Ark. I got N-gauge animals from a local hobby shop. They are too large for the ark scale. The ark should be 6 feet long in order for these animals to be the right scale. Inside here I have 21 different interesting observations about Noah's Ark that you may want to read before you decide the story is not true. Some interesting things. For instance, if Noah was 10 or 12 feet tall, like he may very well have been, he lived to be 950 according to the scriptural account, then the ark built by his cubit would have been much bigger. A cubit is from your elbow to your fingertip. I'm only 6'1", and my cubit is 21 inches. The standard cubit they use to measure things is 18 inches. Even with an 18-inch cubit, a small ark, there was plenty of room, because Noah only had to bring, he could have brought the babies, bring young ones. That would be the obvious conclusion. I figured that out. I'm only 40. Noah was 600. I'm sure he figured out bring babies. Just be sure to get a pink one and a blue one. And they would be smaller. They would live longer after the flood's over, and that's why you're bringing them to begin with. So bringing young on the ark would conserve an awful lot of space. Plus, you only had to bring 2 of each kind, not 2 of each species. I taught biology for years. I'm very familiar with the classification system. But the skeptics will always say, well, you know, there's X number of species in the world, and they couldn't all fit on the ark. Well, now, just a minute. True, there are 250 varieties of dogs. But Noah only had to have 2 of the dog kind on the ark. The Bible says he brought 2 of each kind. That would include the foxes, the wolves, the coyotes, the hyenas, and the dogs, all in 2 animals. In the last 4,400 years since the flood, there has been a lot of variation within the created kind. Ask anybody that raises anything, any animals, a cattle breeder, horse breeder, pig breeder, corn raiser, anything, they will tell you there's an awful lot of variation available, but it's always within limits. You can get bigger and bigger pigs, but you're never going to get a pig as big as this building. There are limits. And anybody that raises animals will tell you there are limits. And there has been a lot of variation since the flood, but that's not evolution. It's still the same basic kind of animal. The wolves and the hyenas and the dogs and the coyotes and the foxes are the same family. Now, our classification system of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species wasn't made until the last couple of hundred years. And that is not at all what God was using. God said, Noah, 2 of each kind, not 2 of each species. So don't fall for that argument that he had to bring 2 of every individual species. There's been speciation. There's been a lot of interesting research about Noah's Ark. On Mount Ararat, right at the corner of Turkey and Russia and Iran and Iraq, is Mount Ararat. There are 2 competing schools of thought on this. One group thinks the ark is actually on Mount Ararat, and it may be. There's another group, who I know, Ron Wyatt right here, had lunch with him one time, talked to him several times. Another group that thinks Noah's Ark may be this object right here, this boat-shaped object. The Turkish government thinks it is. They think the ark has collapsed in on itself and folded out. The structure there that I just showed you is 515 feet long, which is exactly 300 Royal Egyptian cubits. If that's the ark, I don't know. Here's it is right here. The Turkish government has built a visitor center, and they started construction on a highway, but the political situation over there is very unstable. So they've kind of slowed things down. There is a full-time fellow there who lives there to keep people from stealing pieces of, if they think that's Noah's Ark. Anchor stones have been found. Okay, go ahead and skip up there, if you would, brother, to the next one. The credibility of the ark actually being there's a big CBS special on that, and a lot of people say it is. Then, of course, Time and Discover Magazine both wrote a retraction saying, oh, CBS didn't know what they were talking about. They should never have run that. See, the scoffers, skeptics can't stand competition on a level playing field. They want to have a majority of the market and don't let anybody even see the other evidence for the other side. If it happens to support the other side, hey, we can't let them see that. That's why creation is not taught in our public schools, because the scoffers know it would overwhelm evolution. Evolution is a silly, crazy idea that doesn't have any common sense to believe that, and so they don't want competition for their belief. They talk about the geologic column. Let me back up just a little here. These scoffers talk about this geologic column, these different layers of strata. And I taught earth science and biology for many years. The geologic column doesn't exist any place in the world. The best explanation of the fossils that are found, like this human shoe print with a trilobite embedded in the toe and heel, and the evolutionist says trilobite lived 600 million years ago. There's a human shoe print where man stepped on two of them. Polystrata fossils prove those layers are not different ages. All of those layers that you see in the fictitious geologic column were deposited rapidly during the one-year-long flood. The world was completely overwhelmed for 1 year, and polystrata fossils are found frequently around the world. Trees petrified, standing straight up, running through all the layers. But the geologic column, the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, Archaeozoic eras, and the different periods, you know, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, all that stuff, the only place you can find that geologic column is in the textbook. It doesn't exist any place in the world, and that is the Bible to the evolutionist. The geologic column is the Bible to the evolutionist. They interpret everything in light of the geologic strata that it's found in. That's how they date the fossils. Which strata was it found in? Here's from workers at a wall in France digging a highway, and tree trunks found petrified, standing straight up, running through all the layers of strata. Petrified fossils are very common. In the vertical position, polystrata fossils running through more than one layer. The idea of the Earth being billions of years old is crazy. It cannot be billions of years old. But it was the geologic column that influenced Charles Darwin to doubt the Scripture, and Darwin became ultimately an atheist because of his teaching in the geologic column. Is that up to the next number there, brother? I can't see what numbers are on there. Skip up to... I go to the end of this one? No. Yeah, I think so. Okay. So the evidence for evolution and great age for the Earth is, they say, well, each of these layers are different ages by millions of years. Cannot be true. I can demonstrate that quickly. Mount St. Helens did a classic case of evidence for that. Mount St. Helens blew 900 feet of sediment down into the valley. I'll show you pictures in just a second. And it was all stratified. The worldwide flood caused all of the layers of strata. Noah was in the ark for a year. They talk about Pangea, continents fitting together as proof for evolution. The textbooks treat this subject as if it is a fact, and it certainly is not. They'll say 200 million years ago, Pangea probably began to break apart. Well, it's no question that it's 200 million years in their mind, but the fact that they fit together doesn't prove they ever were together. That's pure coincidence based on the water level. This building is perfectly parallel to the house across the street. That proves they broke apart 40 million years ago and Cook Street oozed up in between them. Proves no such thing. Let me give you a creationist interpretation of what happened. Starting with this subject of what happened to the giant woolly mammoths. The mammoths up in Siberia are found frozen, frequently standing up. Nearly every kind of animal has been found frozen up in Siberia. They found bobcat, jaguar, lynx, camels 15 feet tall, rhinoceros, elephants, woolly mammoth. No people yet, but boatloads of fossils that are frozen can be found in the Siberian regions. The problem with the skeptics is they don't understand the original creation. There was a canopy of water that protected the earth. It was like a terrarium. It was designed for man to live here forever had he not sinned. As it was after the sin, they only lived 900 plus years. So the original creation was different. That's where all the giant animals come in, and the world was loaded with trees. And so all the coal formations and natural gas formations and oil deposits and all that were laid out because of the worldwide flood. The flood lasted 1 year. Here's what one creationist, myself and many others believe this. This is one school of thought for what may have happened to cause the worldwide flood. The mammoths are found frozen in a standing position. Let me skip through a few things here. From some of the temples around the world, like Stonehenge, Edixus, Amun-Ra, it has been determined that the Earth has wobbled throughout its history. The North Pole has not always been where it is. The Earth today is tilted over 23.5 degrees. I believe this happened because of the flood. One theory is that the Earth was struck by an ice meteor, and many ice meteors are floating around in space, just giant snowballs. If an ice meteor came close to the Earth, or through our solar system, some of the fragments may have been pulled off, and that might explain why Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune all have ice rings around them. They may have been spun into centrifugal orbit because of the ice meteor coming through. That may explain the craters on the moon. Lots of craters and even flow formations on the moon where water was flowing, and on Mars, but yet no water. It may have been hit by an ice meteor and then subsequently vaporized. It's just a theory, but because ice at low temperatures, 300 to 400 below zero, is magnetic, the ice, as it came closer to the Earth, it may have blown apart And the stronger magnetic field the Earth used to have would suck the ice particles to the North and South Pole. And the 300 and 400 below zero ice would freeze the mammoths rapidly, food still in their teeth, still in their stomach, undigested. The magnetic North Pole seems to be the center of the ice age, not the geographic North Pole. So the magnetic North Pole seems to have had something to do with the so-called ice age. The South Pole has 14,000 feet of ice, and yet it never snows at the South Pole. It's considered a desert. So either it took millions of years to accumulate 14,000 feet of ice, or it was all dumped there rapidly. While the volcanoes are going off and the ash is being mixed in, you would get thousands of layers of ice and ash and a mixture of all sorts of things at the South Pole, rapidly. The mammoths, as it began to snow, were buried, died, suffocated, found with their food in their stomach, still green today. The meat is still edible today. I stayed at a man's house in Canada a couple of months ago. His dad was up on the north slope of Alaska. They ate mammoth meat. Been buried 4,400 years since the flood, would be the creationist interpretation. As the ice went, excuse me, as the ice went racing out across from the poles, from this ice dump, it would carve out the glacier effects that we see, the huge scratches across the Canadian Shield and the Matterhorn and the obvious glacial effects across the northern and southern parts around the world. The world then, covered with two giant ice spots, would have two cold waves that would come off and cause that canopy of protective water to collapse. And it rained 40 days and 40 nights like the Bible says. The water came from this ice barrier. Also, the Bible says the fountains of the deep were broken up. Now, everybody knows within the crust of the earth there is enormous volume of water. Volcanoes frequently shoot out steam and water, millions and millions of gallons. I don't know how much was there in the pre-flood conditions. It may have been more. But if the fountains of the deep broke up, like geysers shooting out, maybe that rips along the Earth's crust, like San Andreas Fault or Hayward Fault or Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Maybe those are the rips where the water came gushing out. Don't know, I wasn't there. But that hot water, striking normal ocean water, would kill all the fish in that area. You would have thermal shock, explaining why fossils are found, like the diatoms, are found in huge, thick layers. In Lompoc, California, the diatomaceous earth is 1,500 feet thick. And yet diatoms are microscopic animals that takes 1,000 years to get 1 inch of accumulation at the bottom of the ocean, at today's rate. But with a thermal shock situation, with hot water out of the Earth's crust hitting the oceans, they would die by the zillions and fall to the bottom. To prove the diatomaceous earth was formed rapidly, a baleen whale skeleton was found in a diatomaceous earth quarry by Grefco Corporation in Lompoc, California. The whale was 80 feet long. It was standing on its tail in solid diatomaceous earth. Well, now, if it takes 1,000 years to get an inch of diatoms, did the whale stand there in balance for millions of years on his tail while the diatoms slowly formed around him? I find that very difficult to believe. It had to be a catastrophe, a disaster, trapped that whale. Same thing with the chalk cliffs of Dover. Chalk is microscopic organisms that live in the ocean, and they are 300 feet thick over there, solid chalk. It had to be some type of thermal shock to do that. Noah, in his ark on top of the water, for 1 year, the Bible says the flood lasted just over 12 months. Noah was floating safely in the ark as thousands and thousands of feet of sediment were being deposited under the ark, under the water. Just the earth turning under the moon, with the tidal pull of the moon, with no continents to stop it, the tidal pull would constantly reshuffle and reseparate the sediments under there. You can get a jar of dirt out of your yard, put some water in it, and shake it up and set it down. In 10 minutes, you'll see layers begin to form. Gravels go to the bottom, then sands, then clays, then topsoils. A perfect soil profile. Do it any place. Go get a jar of dirt and add the water. That's what happened during the year-long flood. All of the layers of strata that we see were formed rapidly. Some of the animals were buried and became fossils. Other animals floated around for a while and bloated and rotted. As they rotted, their carcasses fell apart. And so when they finally were buried, as the waters went down, if they were buried, they might be buried in tangled up heaps, fossil graveyards, which are found all over the world. And usually the bones, like this dinosaur backbone here, are found with no legs, no head, no tail, no rib cage, and no teeth marks. This animal was not scavenged, it rotted and fell apart. This dinosaur backbone is bent backwards, twisted, contorted positions. Fossil graveyards, tangled up messes of bones, sometimes 3 or 4 miles deep, solid bones, are all over this world. Fossil graveyards every place. I think the obvious interpretation is a catastrophe of global proportions that caused that. People say, well, where did all the water go? After this flood, where did the water go? The Bible says in Genesis chapter 8, more about the flood. After the flood, God remembered Noah and all the cattle, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. The word assuaged means to sink down. The water did not soak into the ground, and it did not dry back up into the atmosphere. The atmosphere couldn't hold that much water. And I'm sure Mr. Till will bring that out. It couldn't rain that much, and there's not enough water in the oceans to cover the earth. Well, there's enough water in the oceans right now to cover the earth 12,000 feet deep. If the earth were smoothed out, if the mountains were pushed down and the valleys, the oceans weren't as deep, if the earth were smooth, the water would be 12,000 feet, over 2 miles deep, over the entire surface of the globe. There is plenty of water in that ocean to flood the world. Psalms chapter 104 talks more about the flood. The Bible says, God laid the foundations of the earth that it should not be removed forever. Thou coverest it with the deep. That's the ocean, the flood. God covered the earth with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. There have always been skeptics who say, well, it was a local flood. Look, you don't get a local flood with the water going over the mountains. Plus, if it's a local flood, why did God tell Noah to build a boat? Why didn't he say, Noah, move? There's going to be a flood. It was a worldwide flood. At the voice of at thy rebuke, they fled. They referring to the water. The water fled. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away. The water raced away. You say, where's it going to go? If the world's covered with water, water seeks its own level, where's it going to go? Keep reading, verse number 8. They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys, unto the place which thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth. This phrase, they go up by the mountains, is an Old English phrase. Today's language would more likely say it like this. The mountains ascend, the valleys descend. Many reference Bibles say that. The mountains ascend, the valleys descend. What I believe happened after the flood, the crust of the earth, being very thin and flexible, the crust of the earth sank in the skinnier spots. The thinner places on the earth's crust sank down. The crust of the earth is thinner than the skin of an apple compared to the apple, as far as proportion. Very thin. I taught earth science for years. Under the continents, the crust is about 25 miles thick. Under all of the ocean basins, the crust is 3 to 5 miles thick. Much thinner. I believe that's the thin spots that sank down, the mountains lifted up, and the water raced off into the holes, carving features like Grand Canyon and Badlands in a matter of hours, because you had enormous volumes of water moving through soft sediment. The rock layers were formed, the sediment layers were deposited during the year-long flood. As the mountains lifted up and the valleys sank down, the more cracks appeared in the earth, and it might be a coincidence, but all of the mountain ranges in the world follow the coastlines. Just look at your globe. Mountain ranges follow the coastlines. Oceans sank down, the mountains lifted up. Some of the mountains lifted up slower, leaving behind smooth, rounded mountains like the Appalachians. Some lifted up faster, leaving behind rugged mountains like the Rockies. The earth cracked up into plates, either because of the impact of the meteor or because the fountains of the deep broke up right there, or later on, a year later, when the mountains arose. There are 3 possibilities of when the cracks and mountain ranges appeared. Rock strata that are found bent like this all over the world are a very common feature. You don't bend rock layers like that, twisted, contorted rock layers. They had to be bent while they were soft mud. As the mountains arose and the valley sank down, those layers were formed. The water ran off, forming features like that. The entire top of Mount Everest, the top 3,000 feet of that mountain, is covered with sedimentary rock packed full of remains of animals that once lived in the sea. Seashells, clams in the closed position are found on top of Mount Everest, tallest mountain in the world. Mount Everest wasn't there before the flood. Mount Everest rose up after the flood. The Himalayan range didn't exist until after the flood. The earth didn't have any giant mountain ranges, and it didn't have any deep ocean basins. So the argument will come up, well, hey, is there enough water, could it rain enough to cover Mount Everest? No, you're thinking of the wrong world. Scoffers are ignorant of what the original creation was like, and they're ignorant of the flood. The mountains rose after the flood, and the valleys sank down. The water raced off into those holes. Is there another? Yeah, switch to the next one there real quick, brother. I got about, how much, 4 minutes left?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to get through this Mount St. Helens real quickly and give you an example of what might happen. So the people will say that the idea of the worldwide flood is impossible. Haven't really studied the evidence. There is sedimentary rock all over the world, and petrified clams in the closed position are very common. And I'll have to skip some of this, but the center part of the oceans, the abyss, is the deep part. The other part is called the continental shelf, where it's not as deep. About half of the ocean, here, at least at the Arctic Ocean, is the abyss. The other half is continental shelf. The oceans were smaller after the flood, I believe, for a while, because the textbooks all say here, millions of years it took the Colorado River to carve the Grand Canyon from solid rock. Well, they're basing that on a couple of faulty assumptions. They're basing on the assumption that the Colorado River didn't start on it until after the rock was solid rock. If it was all soft mud, and those are obviously mud layers turned to solid rock, then the erosion would be very rapid. Mount St. Helens did that. When it blew in 1980, the top of the mountain began to blow, and then the north slope slid down. And the volcano made a mudslide, scalding hot mud and ash slid down for many miles. Matter of fact, this computer image, the mud slid all the way down and blocked off the Toutle River. Here's a picture of the mud dam blocking off the Toutle River. 5 days later, the water backed up over the top and went over the top of the dam. Here you have lots of water behind a soft mud dam, and erosion was very rapid. It carved a canyon 140 feet deep, 1,000 feet wide, 2,000 feet long, and it carved it out in 15 minutes. When the scientists went down into the canyon after water got back to stabilize, they noticed the canyon sides of it were all stratified, all nice, neat layers. That's because as the mud flowed in, hydrologic sorting automatically separates the particles by density. Heavier stuff went to the bottom, and you can go there today, and some geologists will say, oh, this bottom layer is 800 million years old. And it was all formed in 1980, rapidly. Textbooks always say the Grand Canyon is kind of puzzling because it loops like a slow gradient. Mississippi loops and meanders around because it's low gradient, but it also has steep sides like a fast-moving high gradient stream. They say it's kind of puzzling. How did this canyon form? Well, see, they're thinking of it all wrong. The Colorado River did not make Grand Canyon. The flood made Grand Canyon. The Colorado River just happens to flow through the crack, that's all. The logs that were floated in the Spirit Lake, here's Mount St. Helens in the background, the logs floated 3 square miles of logs floated there. Many of them got waterlogged and began to float in the upright position and then sank to the bottom. Remember I showed you the polystrata trees running through all the different layers of strata? That formed during the flood. All those layers deposited rapidly. Mount St. Helens is doing the very same thing for us today. Scuba divers go under there and say there are 20,000 logs in the bottom of Spirit Lake right now, stuck in the mud. All over the world you can find tree trunks petrified in the standing position. Yellowstone has hundreds of them. If they fall over, they will break. And you go through any petrified forest and you'll see the tree probably petrified standing up and then fell over a couple of hundred years later. I think my time is up. After the flood, the waters assuaged and the waters returned from off the earth. The water, as the mountains rose and the valleys sank down, the water would tend to race back and forth for a while. It says that in Genesis chapter 3. And the secondary erosion would take place as the layers were wiped off and new layers deposited on top from the waters going back and forth. It wasn't safe for Noah to get out of the ark for a short time. And all of these features of this millions of years ago stuff ought to be illegal in our textbooks. It has nothing to do with science, and you cannot prove those layers are millions of years old. That whole geologic column is the Bible to the evolutionist, and it's a fraud, it's a hoax, it does not exist any place. That book, the Bible explanation, the worldwide flood, is the best, most reasonable explanation of all the features we see on this world today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hovind. I fully intended to say at the beginning of this debate that, as has been shown already, I would expect you to give your kind attention to both of our speakers, and please be mindful that they are holding the floor and that we need to give them the utmost.
So let's see, if there are 4,000 years since Ken Ham's flood, and let's say, as he said many times, there are 7,000 kinds. Today, the very, very lowest estimate is that there are about 8.7 million species, but a much more reasonable estimate is it's 50 million or even 100 million when you start counting the viruses and the bacteria and all the beetles that must be extant in the tropical rainforest that we haven't found. So we'll take a number which I think is pretty reasonable, 16 million species today, okay? If these came from 7,000 kinds, that's, let's say we have 7,000 subtracted from 15 million, that's 15,993. We have 4,000 years, we have 365 and a quarter days a year. We would expect to find 11 new species every day. So you'd go out into your yard, you wouldn't just find a different bird, a new bird, you'd find a different kind of bird, a whole new species of bird every day, a new species of fish, a new species of organisms you can't see, and so on. I mean, this would be enormous news. The last 4,000 years, people would have seen these changes among us. So the Cincinnati Enquirer, I imagine, would carry a column right next to the weather report. Today's new species, and it would list these 11 every day. But we see no evidence of that. There's no evidence of these species. There just simply isn't enough time. Now, as you may know, I was graduated from engineering school, and I got a job at Boeing. I worked on 747s. I Okay, everybody relax. I was very well supervised. Everything's fine. There's a tube in the 747 I kind of think of as my tube. But that aside, I traveled the highways of Washington State quite a bit. I was a young guy. I had a motorcycle. I used to go mountain climbing in Washington State, Oregon. And you can drive along and find these enormous boulders on top of the ground. Enormous rocks, huge, sitting on top of the ground. Now, out there in regular academic pursuits, regular geology, people have discovered that there used to be a lake in what is now Montana, which we charmingly refer to as Lake Missoula. It's not there now, but the evidence for it, of course, is, if I may, overwhelming. And so an ice dam would form at Lake Missoula, and once in a while it would break. It would build up and break, and there were multiple floods in my old state of Washington State. And just before we go on, let me just say, go Seahawks. That was very gratifying. Very gratifying for me. Anyway, you drive along the road, and there are these rocks. So if, as is asserted here at this facility, that the heavier rocks would sink to the bottom during a flood event, the big rocks, and especially their shape, instead of aerodynamic, the hydrodynamic, the water-changing shape as water flows past. You'd expect them to sink to the bottom. But here are these enormous rocks right on the surface, and there's no shortage of them. If you go driving in Washington State or Oregon, they're readily available. So how could those be there if the Earth is just 4,000 years old? How could they be there if this one flood caused that? Another remarkable thing I'd like everybody to consider, inherent in this worldview, is that somehow Noah and his family were able to build a wooden ship that would house 14,000 individuals. There are 7,000 kinds, and there's a boy and a girl for each one of those. So it's about 14,008 people. And these people were unskilled. As far as anybody knows, they had never built a wooden ship before. Furthermore, they had to get all these animals on there, and they had to feed them, and I understand that Mr. Ham has some explanations for that, which I frankly find extraordinary, but this is the premise of the bit. And we can then run a test, a scientific test. People in the early 1900s built an extraordinarily large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built. It had a motor on it for winching cables and stuff. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way. And in all that twisting, it leaked. It leaked like crazy. The crew could not keep the ship dry. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, loss of all 14 hands. So there were 14 crewmen aboard a ship built by very, very skilled shipwrights in New England. These guys were the best in the world at wooden shipbuilding. And they couldn't build a boat as big as the Ark is claimed to have been. Is that reasonable? Is that possible? That the best shipbuilders in the world couldn't do what 8 unskilled people, men and their wives, were able to do. If you visit the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., it's 163 acres, and they have 400 species. By the way, this picture that you're seeing was taken by spacecraft in space, orbiting the Earth. If you told my grandfather, let alone my father, that we had that capability, they would have been amazed. That capability comes from our fundamental understanding of gravity, of material science, of physics, and life science, where you go looking. This place is often, as any zoo, is often deeply concerned and criticized for how it treats its animals. They have 400 species on 163 acres, 66 hectares. Is it reasonable that Noah and his colleagues, his family, were able to maintain 14,000 animals and themselves and feed them aboard a ship that was bigger than anyone's ever been able to build? Now, here's the thing. What we want in science as practiced out on the outside, is an ability to predict. We want to have a natural law that is so obvious and clear, so well understood, that we can make predictions about what will happen. We can predict that we can put a spacecraft in orbit and take a picture of Washington, D.C. We can predict that if we provide this much room for an elephant, it will live healthily for a certain amount of time. So I'll give you an example. In the explanation provided by traditional science of how we came to be, we find, as Mr. Ham alluded to many times in his recent remarks, we find a sequence of animals in what generally is called the fossil record. This would be to say, when we look at the layers that you would find in Kentucky, you look at them carefully, you find a sequence of animals, a succession. And as one might expect, when you're looking at old records, there's some pieces seem to be missing, a gap. So scientists got to thinking about this. There are lungfish that jump from pond to pond in Florida and end up in people's swimming pools. And there are amphibians, frogs and toads, croaking and carrying on. And so people wondered if there wasn't a fossil or an organism, an animal that had lived, that had characteristics of both. People over the years had found that in Canada, there was clearly a fossil marsh, a place that used to be a swamp, had dried out. And they found all kinds of happy swamp fossils there, ferns, so on, organisms, animals, fish that were recognized. And people realized that if this, with the age of the rocks there, as computed by traditional scientists, with the age of the rocks there, this would be a reasonable place to look for an animal, a fossil of an animal that lived there. And indeed, scientists found it, Tiktaalik, this fish lizard guy. And they found several specimens. It wasn't one individual. In other words, they made a prediction that this animal would be found, and it was found. So far, Mr. Ham and his worldview, the Ken Ham creation model, does not have this capability. It cannot make predictions and show results. Here's an extraordinary one that I find remarkable. There are certain fish, the top minnows, that have the remarkable ability to have sex with other fish, traditional fish sex, and they can have sex with themselves. Now, one of the old questions in life science, everybody, one of the old sort of chin strokers, is why does any organism, whether you're an ash tree, a sea jelly, a squid, a marmot, why does anybody have sex? I mean, there are more bacteria in your tummy right now than there are humans on Earth. And bacteria, they don't bother with that, man. They just like split themselves in half. They get new bacteria. Like, let's get her done. Let's go. But why does think of all the trouble a rose bush goes to make a flower, and the thorns and the bees swimming, flying around, interacting. Why does anybody bother with all that? And the answer seems to be your enemies. And your enemies are not lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, no. Your enemies are germs and parasites. That's what's going to get you. Germs and parasites. My first cousin's son died tragically from essentially the flu. This is not some story I heard about. It's my first cousin once removed. Because apparently the virus had the right genes to attack his genes. So when you have sex, you have a new set of genes. You have a new mixture. So people studied these top minnows, and they found that the ones who reproduced sexually had fewer parasites than the ones that reproduced on their own. This black spot disease. Wait, there's more. In these populations, with flooding and so on, with river ponds get isolated, then they dry up, then the river flows again. In between, some of the fish will have sex with other fish sometimes, and they'll have sex on their own, what's called asexually. And those fish, the ones that are in between, sometimes this, sometimes that, they have an intermediate number of infections. In other words, the explanation provided by evolution made a prediction And the prediction's extraordinary and subtle, but there it is. How else would you explain it? And to Mr. Ham and his followers, I say this is something that we in science want. We want the ability to predict. And your assertion that there's some difference between the natural laws that I use to observe the world today and the natural laws that existed 4,000 years ago is extraordinary and unsettling.
A worldwide flood would have deposited trees in many layers, loaded with ash and volcanoes going off at the same time. And the trees have a root system out just a few feet, and then all of the roots are broken off. None of those trees have an intact root system. They were all yanked out by the roots, just like Mount St. Helens did. Exactly. Go scuba diving under the log mat at Mount St. Helens, you'll see the exact same thing today. It's proving it all over again. And then he says, because there are 27 layers, and the trees are 500 years old, simple mathematics, you can multiply those two together. You're assuming now that all those trees are different, come from different forests. Many of those trees, and I can show you the picture again if you'd like, one tree will be running 6 or 8 or 10 feet tall. The next tree starts 3 feet higher than the one right next to it. And yet the tree is 10 feet tall. So they're all running through the same layers of strata. All of those trees, I would contend, were deposited in a 1-year-long flood. All 27 layers were deposited rapidly. So to multiply 27 by 500 and to say that proves the Bible isn't correct is very faulty logic. And then you assume, of course, that the people 4,400 years ago in the pre-flood world were ignoramuses. I would say we today, by their standards, would be the ignoramuses. Adam walked with God, for one thing. Adam lived 930 years. The accumulated knowledge that could be passed down from generation to generation. Noah's daddy, Lamech, could have known Adam. Adam was still alive when Lamech was here, according to the dates given in Scripture. So there was an enormous amount of accumulated knowledge, and the people at 900 years of age would learn an awesome amount. Plus, in the pre-flood environment described by the Bible, where they lived longer and the animals grew bigger, increased oxygen, especially during fetal development, causes much higher IQs, and the people probably had IQs of 300 or 400. I can't prove that scientifically, but they did some enormous things, some incredible things back then, and all sorts of fossils have been found. I talked to a man 2 weeks ago who worked in a coal mine. He was working in front of the shovel as they were scooping out the coal, and they found a cable, a braided rope cable, similar to what we use today, but it was stainless steel, found embedded in the coal, 200 and some feet long. Gold bells have been found in the coal. Gold chains 6 feet long found in anthracite coal in Wyoming. All of these things documented. Man and animals, and all these animals that died in the flood were very advanced. The men were, and had all sorts of things. The Bible says the pre-flood world, the people were artificers of brass and iron. They had iron before the flood. His contention is Noah couldn't use any iron. Ron Wyatt, the pictures I showed you of Noah's Ark, if Ron Wyatt has it, is not on Mount Ararat. It's in the mountains of Ararat, like he mentioned. It's 12 miles from the actual mountain, Mount Ararat. The little valley it's in is called the Valley of 8. And there's a little village there called the Village of 8, and nobody knows why the village is named that or the valley is named that. But it might be because that's where the 8 people got off the ark. Ron Wyatt found rivets, iron rivets, about the size of my thumb and about this long. I held them in my hand, badly rusted, some of them not too badly rusted, iron rivets. Noah may have bolted that ark together. If the pre-flood trees were growing huge, like everything else was growing huge in the first 1,600 years, Noah had giant logs to work with. And it took him 120 years to build the boat. And God gave him the instructions of how to build it. And it wasn't designed to go anyplace. It didn't have to sail like a 300-foot-long ship has to sail someplace. It just had to float. It was a barge. Where was there to go, for one thing? I mean, the world's covered with water. So Noah only had to float. It could easily be done. And the contention that because we can't do it today, I would go back to the pyramid analogy, that's faulty logic. As far as the science of shipbuilding, Noah's Ark, according to the scriptural dimensions, was a ratio of 6-to-1, which is the perfect ratio to withstand storms. 6-to-1 ships, that's the way most of the ships are built, to approximately that length to width ratio, because they automatically face into the waves and they can't get capsized that way. Many tests have been done on models of Noah's Ark, and they indicate that ark could have stood waves of 200 feet. That's what the analysis shows in the tanks that they test these ships in. And then, of course, he assumes that I love the way he always gave the extreme examples of, well, what about all these giraffes and elephants? Was the ark full of giraffes and elephants? I mean, the average size of an animal today is smaller than a sheep if you average all the animals. Why pick the extreme of a giraffe and an elephant? And again, I go back to say, well, Noah could have brought babies, could have brought young ones. That would be the obvious thing. I would do that. I'm only 40. I'm sure Noah figured that out. And God brought the animals to Noah. Noah didn't have to go get them. That's what the Bible says. God brought the animals to Noah. And then he used the extremes to get that boat full of elephants and giraffes and sail into Hurricane Andrew. Well, of course, you're assuming that the whole year-long flood was hurricane conditions. We don't know that. The Bible doesn't say that. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. You don't always have a hurricane when it rains. You realize that. And it may not have been any hurricanes. It may have been a bad storm, lasted 40 days. The water came up, the water coming out from underneath. Noah might have been hundreds of miles from the cracks, the San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. He may have been in very tranquil seas for the whole year. The Bible doesn't say. So for me to have to prove that a boat could withstand a hurricane is totally off the subject. I don't have to prove that. He would have to prove that Noah wasn't in tranquil seas. You can't prove that either. It's outside the realm of science. Science has to be observable, testable, and demonstratable. I can demonstrate that a 6-to-1 ratio ship is the perfect ratio to withstand violent weather. That has been demonstrated over and over in shipbuilding courses and things like that. Approximately 6-to-1 ratio. I cannot prove that today we could build a 450-foot long boat that would float, but I cannot prove today how they built the pyramid either. I have no idea how they built it. And then he said that I didn't offer any scientific proof. I think I did. I think I showed that by only bringing 2 of each kind and not 2 of each individual species, they could easily fit on the ark. That limits the number way down. Let's mention that. Noah's boat only had to float. Let's see. 300-foot max. That's, of course, by today's standards. If you have pre-flood environment with the people much smarter and the people much stronger, and Noah with 100 and some years to do it, he could easily have built that boat. I have no doubt believing that. And he certainly did not prove scientifically it could not be done. He assumed, of course, no iron or steel. And as I mentioned, Ron Wyatt and others have found iron rivets, so it may have been bolted together or it could have been pegged together. There are over 250 different flood accounts from cultures all over the world. There must be a reason for that. Why do 250 different cultures around the world talk about a flood, a worldwide flood in most of them, where a family, or sometimes they say brother and sister, but a family were saved in a boat of some kind? Many of the stories are twisted and perverted, and they don't all match exactly, but they all indicate they must have all come from a common source, like maybe the real worldwide flood. Let's see if I covered everything here. The Bible says the ark was made of gopher wood. The Hebrew phrase there, gopher wood, means laminated wood. I held in my hand a piece that Ron Wyatt brought back from the ark site in the Valley of 8. It was about 2.5 feet long, about 4 inches thick, and it was 3 layers of wood cross-grained to each other. Plywood, similar, like the beams in this ceiling, laminated wood. And if that is indeed what gopher wood means, and Noah built it out of laminated wood, I held it in my hand, petrified, very heavy. And the layers were stuck together with tar, and they had been pressed together, where the 3 layers were bonded to each other, just like we make plywood today. And I'd say a 600-year-old fellow with a higher IQ than we have today would figure out a way to do that, no problem. Then, let's see if I cover all this. He talked about me pulling a theatrical stunt, or I forget his exact words there, by using slides and charts to dazzle the audience and to overwhelm you with evidence. And yet his whole presentation was offering evidence with lack of slides and visuals that you can't build a boat over 300 feet long. They're doing exactly what he's accusing me of doing. I'm trying to educate. I'm trying to show it could be done. It's very scientifically possible. And the example of using all the extremes. Then he mentioned about the different species, 100 different varieties or species of the bovine family, the cows and sheep. I don't know how they were divided before the flood, but you can ask any cattle breeder. You can get a variety in just 20 or 30 years. Dogs, you could start with 50 dogs from the dog pound, get 50 generic mutts, and in less than 200 years, you could develop all 250 varieties that we have today on the earth. You could go from the Great Dane to the St. Bernard to the Chihuahua. That can be done. It's incredible the variation available within the genetic structure. With natural breeding processes, usually the species tends to remain more stable. But if there's geographic separation, isolation, because of living on different continents, then the species tend to vary even more. And eventually they might get to the place where they cannot interbreed. Alaska rabbits cannot interbreed with Florida rabbits. But Alaska rabbits can interbreed with rabbits from Minnesota. And Minnesota rabbits can interbreed with Florida rabbits. So the Florida rabbit and the Alaska rabbit have diversified where they're no longer interfertile because their breeding cycle is different. But they're still a rabbit. Nothing has changed. It's the same kind of animal. It's a different variety now of rabbit. And some can stand the cold weather, some can stand the hot weather. But that could easily happen in 4,400 years. That can be done in 20 years in the laboratory with no problem. Let's see. He wants me to believe, he wanted you to believe, that it's impossible for these animals to vary in 5,000 years from the kinds on the ark to the varieties we have today, and yet he believes tomatoes changed into people. The philosophy of evolution. You talk about variation. I don't care how much time you give them zillions of years, you're never going to get a tomato to change into a person, no matter how gradually. They talk about, well, it's a miracle, you know, if a frog turns into a prince instantly, that's got to be a miracle. That's a fairy tale. You know, you kiss the frog and it turns to a prince. I agree, that would be a miracle. And yet evolution teaches the frog did change to the prince, but it took 300 million years. It is still a miracle. If a man races across the air, we say, well, it's a miracle. Well, if he walks slowly through the air, is it less of a miracle? Time is, that's silly. I mean, oh, no, that didn't happen fast. That would be a miracle, but it happens slowly. Evolution is still just a pagan religion, and it relies on miracles. They cannot explain where the original matter came from. They can't explain where the laws came from. They can't explain where life came from. And yet they want to teach that in the science classes and have our kids learn that. And they're upset about creation getting into the classroom. They better look in the mirror and see what's in those textbooks now. We're teaching all kinds of pagan things that cannot be proven. We're teaching the frog turned into the prince. I taught biology. You should see the charts. There's the frog at the bottom and the prince at the top. It's the same fairy tale, and that has never been demonstrated. So if their argument is we shouldn't have creation in the classroom because it is not scientific, I'll say, I agree. Let's get evolution out for the very same reasons. Evolution is not scientific either. And unless they're going to teach both, they should teach neither one. I say, well, a majority of scientists believe in evolution. The majority of people believed the world was flat at one time too. They didn't flatten it out. And you can't use majority opinion as an argument at all. The assumptions, though, that he brought up here, assuming, of course, that man is ignorant and we are advanced, is a faulty assumption. I think man was advanced and we are ignorant. Prove that's wrong. As far as special diets, the Bible says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 21, God said, "And take thou unto thee of all food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee, and it shall be for food for thee and for them." If you refer back to Genesis 1:29, God told Adam and Eve and the animals, Genesis 1:29 and 30, all the animals and all the people were vegetarian before the flood. Nobody ate meat. He didn't have to keep the lions away from the lambs on the ark. They were all vegetarian, and people can live fine on vegetables and fruits today. Even grizzly bears can get by on nuts and berries, though Yogi doesn't like to. They would like to have meat. And panda bears can eat a wide variety of food. Panda bears can eat meat. They're usually too lazy to go get it, but if you feed a panda bear meat, he'll eat it. Ask a zookeeper if panda bears are restricted to a particular kind of bamboo. I think you'll find that was an over-exaggeration. They can eat a variety. Plus, we don't know that the animals we have today and their specialized diets, they may have adapted to that special diet. That would be adaptation from the last 40, 400 years. They live in a particular forest all their life in generations, and pretty soon they get to where they cannot handle other foods. That's not proof that they all ate that 40, 400 years ago. They may have eaten a wider variety back then, and we may have variation within the created kind where now it is more specialized. That could happen. A friend of mine up in Minnesota has 2 aquariums. He has a saltwater aquarium and a freshwater aquarium. Huge, huge aquariums. Over a 10-year span, he slowly decreased the salt in the saltwater aquarium and slowly increased and added salt to the freshwater aquarium. Within 10 years, he got both types of fish to live just fine in half salt water. And then he put all the fish together in the same aquarium. In 4,400 years, the animals could diversify into the kinds we have today with no problem, and you cannot prove it didn't happen that way. I can't prove it did. By strict definition, science has to be observable, testable, demonstratable. I can't prove that it did. I wasn't there, and neither was he, and neither were you. So it's outside the realm of science. We're going to have to take the written word of God's account, and unless we can find it prove that it's scientifically inaccurate, Aristotle's dictum says if you give the benefit of the doubt to the text unless you can find proof that it's wrong, and we haven't seen any proof that it's wrong. He's also assuming that all the animals were large. As I mentioned, you would bring small ones. He is assuming, of course, that these animals are awake for the whole time. Many animals during storm situations go to sleep or hibernate. I'm not saying they all would, but many animals do. They simply will sleep through the whole thing. And during hibernation, if you study your science, during hibernation, animals recycle their body wastes. A bear will go to sleep for the winter and will actually recycle the urine and feces into his system for the whole time. Amazing how that happens, how the acids and everything are broken down. Do some homework on that, you'll find out I'm exactly right. So we don't know that they produced all these thousands of tons of manure. And the boys, of course, in Noah's family with 8 of them on board, that would be one of their jobs, is to keep the ark clean if it was necessary. I'm not going to call on the miraculous. I'm saying, hey, during storm situation, you forgot about hibernation. As far as methane gas being produced, again, I would go back and say, no, wait a minute. He did not prove that the animals weren't hibernating, and he cannot, and I cannot prove they were. It's outside the realm. We cannot test or demonstrate that. But assuming, of course, the larger animals, which he did, and assuming, of course, they all remained awake the whole time, and assuming, of course, they produced these thousands of tons of manure, there would be a methane problem. But the window, the Bible says the ark had a window 18 cubits, and the phrasing there is just like the people who've been into the ark say it's built, is like this. It said a cubit of 18 inches, that you will finish the ark in a cubit. Those who've been in the ark, and many have been in the last couple hundred years, say it has an 18-inch window all the way along, both sides. A huge raised ridge with an 18-inch window providing very adequate ventilation for the ark. There would not be a methane problem buildup with it exploding. How much time left? 2 minutes. Strange thing I've not given a rebuttal for. I believe I got it all. I would have to say, without apology, like I said at the beginning, I believe this Bible is infallible, inspired, and inerrant. He has not given any proof that the biblical account of the flood did not happen scientifically. If the burden of proof is on me to prove it's scientific, I'd have to say, wait a minute, how can I prove that? It wasn't there. Nobody's going to prove that scientifically. Pardon me? That's my job? Well, I guess I didn't catch that if this is a trick question in the way he designed the question for me to have to prove something, prove animals changed from amoebas into people, prove evolution. We'll debate that sometime. It can't be done.
And it did occur to me when you had my old friend Larry King up there, you could have just asked him. He's been around a long time, and he's a smart guy. He could probably answer for all of us. Now, let's all be attentive to Mr. Nye as he gives us his 30-minute presentation.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Ham, I learned something. Thank you. But let's take it back around to the question at hand. Does Ken Ham's creation model hold up? Is it viable? So for me, of course, take a look. We're here in Kentucky on layer upon layer upon layer of limestone. I stopped at the side of the road today and picked up just a piece of limestone that has a fossil right there. Now, in these many, many layers, in this vicinity of Kentucky, there are coral animals, fossil, zooxanthellae. And when you look at it closely, you can see that they live their entire lives. They lived typically 20 years, sometimes more than that, if the water conditions are correct. And so we are standing on millions of layers of ancient life. How could those animals have lived their entire life and formed these layers in just 4,000 years? There isn't enough time since Mr. Ham's flood for this limestone that we're standing on to have come into existence. My scientific colleagues go to places like Greenland, the Arctic, they go to Antarctica, and they drill into the ice with hollow drill bits. It's not that extraordinary. Many of you have probably done it yourselves, drilling other things, hole saws to put locks in doors, for example. And we pull out long cylinders of ice, long ice rods. And these are made of snow. And by long tradition, it's called snow ice. And snow ice forms over the winter as snowflakes fall and are crushed down by subsequent layers. They're crushed together and trapping the little bubbles. And the little bubbles must needs be ancient atmosphere. There's nobody running around with a hypodermic needle squirting ancient atmosphere into the bubbles. And we find certain of these cylinders to have 680,000 layers. 680,000 snow, winter, summer cycles. How could it be that just 4,000 years ago, all of this ice formed? Let's just run some numbers. This is some scenes from lovely Antarctic. Let's say we have 680,000 layers of snow ice and 4,000 years since the Great Flood. That would mean we'd need 170 summer winter-summer cycles every year for the last 4,000 years. I mean, wouldn't someone have noticed that? Wow, wouldn't someone have noticed that there's been winter-summer 170 times one year? If we go to California, we find enormous stands of bristlecone pines. Some of them are over 6,000 years old, 6,800 years old. There's a famous tree in Sweden, Old Tycho, is 9,550 years old. How could these trees be there if there was an enormous flood just 4,000 years ago? You can try this yourself, everybody. I don't mean to be mean to trees, but get a sapling and put it underwater for a year. It will not survive in general, nor will its seeds. They just won't make it. So how could these trees be that old if the earth is only 4,000 years old? Now, when we go to the Grand Canyon, which is an astonishing place, and I recommend to everybody in the world to someday visit the Grand Canyon, you find layer upon layer of ancient rocks. And if there was this enormous flood that you speak of, wouldn't there have been churning and bubbling and roiling? How would these things have settled out? Your claim that they settled out in an extraordinary short amount of time is, for me, not satisfactory. You can look at these rocks, you can look at rocks that are younger, you can go to seashores where there's sand. This is what geologists on the outside do, study the rate at which soil is deposited at the end of rivers and deltas, and we can see that it takes a long, long time for sediments to turn to stone. Also, in this picture, you can see where one type of sediment has intruded on another type. Now, if that was uniform, wouldn't we expect it all to be even without intrusion? Furthermore, you can find places in the Grand Canyon where you see an ancient riverbed on that side going to an ancient riverbed on that side, and the Colorado River has cut through it. And by the way, if this great flood drained through the Grand Canyon, wouldn't there have been a Grand Canyon on every continent? How could we not have Grand Canyons everywhere if this water drained away in this extraordinary short amount of time, 4,000 years? Now, when you look at these layers carefully, you find these beautiful fossils. And when I say beautiful, I am inspired by them. They're remarkable because we are looking at the past. You find down low, you'll find what you might consider as rudimentary sea animals. Up above, you'll find the famous trilobites. Above that, you might find some clams, some oysters. And above that, you'll find some mammals. You never, ever find a higher animal mixed in with a lower one. You never find a lower one trying to swim its way to the higher one. If it all happened in such an extraordinary short amount of time, if this water drained away just like that, wouldn't we expect to see some turbulence? And by the way, anyone here, really, if you can find one example of that anywhere in the world, the scientists of the world challenge you. They would embrace you. You would be a hero. You would change the world if you could find one example of that anywhere. People have looked and looked and looked. They have not found a single one. Now, here's an interesting thing. These are fossil skulls that people have found all around the world. It's by no means representative of all the fossil skulls that have been found, but these are all over the place. Now, if you were to look at these, I can assure you not any of them is a gorilla, right? If, as Mr. Ham and his associates claim, there was just man and then everybody else, there were just humans and all other species, where would you put modern humans among these skulls? How did all these skulls get all over the earth in these extraordinary fashion? Where would you put us? Well, I can tell you we are on there, and I encourage you, when you go home, to look it up. Now, one of the extraordinary claims associated with Mr. Ham's worldview is that this giant boat, very large wooden ship, went aground safely on a mountain in the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East. And so places like Australia are populated then by animals who somehow managed to get from the Middle East all the way to Australia in the last 4,000 years. Now that to me is an extraordinary claim. We would expect then, somewhere between the Middle East and Australia, we would expect to find evidence of kangaroos. We would expect to find some fossils, some bones. In the last 4,000 years, somebody would have been hopping along there and died along the way, and we'd find them. And furthermore, there's a claim that there was a land bridge that allowed these animals to get from Asia all the way to the continent of Australia, and that land bridge has disappeared in the last 4,000 years. No navigator, no diver, no U.S. Navy submarine, no one's ever detected any evidence of this, let alone any fossils of kangaroos. So your expectation is not met. It doesn't seem to hold up.
You guys believe 20 billion years ago there was a big bang where nothing exploded and produced everything. 4.6 billion years ago the earth cooled down, made a hard rocky crust. It rained on the rocks for millions of years, turned them into soup, and the soup came alive 3 billion years ago. Found somebody to marry, and something to eat, of course, and slowly evolved into everything we see today. There are some lies in our science books. Taught it for 15 years. Even though I'm not teaching it anymore, I still like to study. It's so many neat things to learn. We're going to cover some of that tonight. I'm not against science, I'm not against schools, I'm not against teachers, because most of them don't know what they believe. You have to tell them. They teach the kids it all started with a big bang 20 billion years ago. What exploded? This is what the textbooks teach.
Before the Big Bang, there was nothing, literally nothing, an infinitesimal nugget of space. And then something happened, triggering the most colossal explosion in history.
Yes, boys and girls, you see, nothing exploded, and here we are. So I asked this professor if I could ask him some questions about the Big Bang. I said, where did all this matter come from? He said, well, we don't know that for sure. I said, well, sir, would you please tell me where the laws came from? The universe is run by laws, gravity, centrifugal force, inertia. Who gave the laws? He said, we don't know that either. I said, sir, could you tell me where the energy came from? You know, it takes energy to make a Big Bang. Who bought the gas to run this machine anyway? He said, we don't know that either. I said, sir, could I ask you another question? He said, sure. What else would you like to know? Else? What do you mean else? You haven't told me nothing yet. I said, does Berkeley have a merry-go-round? You see, if a spinning object breaks apart in a frictionless environment, the fragments will all spin the same direction. The professor said, yes, I understand about the conservation of angular momentum. I said, well, good. I'd like to ask you a question then, sir. If the whole universe began as a swirling dot, like you said, why do two planets spin backwards? He said, that's interesting. I said, no, that's more than interesting. It's kind of hard on your Big Bang Theory. Not only that, 6 of the moons are spinning backwards. Why? He said, I don't know. Why do you think they're going backwards? I was hoping he was going to ask that. I said, okay, now, sir, hold it. If I told you that I believe God created the heaven and the earth, like the Bible teaches, you're going to say, and where did God come from? And I don't know. But you said, well, we don't know that for sure. We don't know that either. Don't tell me my theory is religious and yours is science. Oh, no, sir, they're both religious. Evolution is a religion. You have to believe. So I asked the professor, where did the matter come from? He said, I don't know. So basically, I believe in the beginning God, and you believe in the beginning dirt. One professor was getting kind of upset about this time. He said, Mr. Hovind, there are hundreds of varieties of dogs in the world. He said, do you mean to tell me that you believe all these dogs came from 2 dogs off of Noah's Ark? You expect me to believe that? I said, sir, would you look at what you're teaching your students? You're teaching your students that all the dogs in the world came from a rock.
In this series of episodes, we are examining actual original artifacts at the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas, artifacts that challenge evolutionary theory. We've seen that leading spokesmen for the evolutionary movement have said if you find man and dinosaur living contemporaneously, that'll destroy evolutionary theory. Dr. Ernst Mayr challenged Dr. Duane Gish in a live debate by saying, why, if your friends could find man and dinosaur living contemporaneously, that would blow evolution out of the waters. And then the challenge was further made that if it could be proved that something like a complicated mammal, perhaps a horse, could be found in rock assigned 500 million years in age, that would completely destroy evolutionary theory. Now remember, those ages are simply assigned. You can get essentially any age you want out of any rock, just run a different type test. But the rocks are assigned ages assuming evolution to have occurred. What? Find a complicated mammal like a horse in rock that's supposed to be 500 million years old? Let's do better than that. Here we have the Meister print. The Meister print was found in very hard slate among trilobites, assigned an age, according to evolutionary interpretation, assigned an age of 650 million years in the Cambrian. But amazingly, this artifact has a trilobite, an Elrathia gingai trilobite, here in the footprint, and the overlay material that was pulled off also has another Elrathia gingai trilobite. What is this artifact? It is a human sandal print with wear on the outside and the back of the heel, stitching around the side, on both sides, the curvature at the front of the sandal print, terminating about 1.25 inches before the end of this very, very hard Cambrian slate rock. Actually, this was made by a human being, and it's at the bottom of the geologic column. Not only the sandal print was made by a human being, but in addition to that, the print was made by a human being, stepping on at least 2 Elrathia gingai trilobites. This establishes that man was present at the bottom of the geologic column, but for evolution to have any plausibility at all, man has to develop at the top of the geologic column in recent times. Here we have proof in sedimentary rock on a worldwide scale that the entire history of the biota, of living systems, does not demonstrate evolutionary development, but instead demonstrates episodes in a worldwide flood. And at the bottom of the column, man was present. The only plausible explanation for this artifact is that creation is the answer. The God of the Bible is demonstrated to be exactly who He claims He is, and the Bible is demonstrated to be exactly what it claims to be, the Word of the living God.